The time has come for Star Wars Jedi Survivor to be released to the general public, which unfortunately included us this time around as we were not given a review copy. As such, the speed of this video release is a result of plummeting ourselves into sleep debt and sending our general health spiraling into the abyss for a little while. Speaking of the abyss, a lot of people sure do want to cross it. Some of them are cool, but most of them are jerk-offs who deserve to be killed. Cal did in fact end up killing most of them, although the trouble we had doing so varied quite a bit from case to case. We ought to clarify before the video begins in earnest that we aren't individually discussing every beastie in the game, because some of them are either buffed normal enemies or die in less than 15 seconds. If you really want our take on them, we basically hate all of them and think they gargle fat, thick loads. We did make some exceptions for creatures of, shall we say, particular note to us though. Before we assess the threat levels of the various foes encountered in this recent journey of Cal's, we'd like to thank our patrons for their support. We quite literally needed the patron money to get this game in the first place, so we really are thankful for it more now than ever. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into the ranking.
Before I get into Bode, I want to apologize for the delayed upload. It's finals week for me, and while I'm a communication major so school isn't exactly up my ass, I've actually had a surprisingly busy schedule these past few days, and I'm doing my best, so pardon me. Anyways, Bode is pretty difficult, so a bottom spot on a difficulty ranking seems a bit oxymoronic. While contradictory, this is the butt monkey of the list because it actually requires no input at all. No better time to be an asshole with technicalities than with a brand new Star Wars game. He's hard, sure, but you can all the same walk away from your controller and shit your brains out from a corn-laden Chipotle burrito like I did and have the exact same outcome, all of which was unrecorded, unfortunately. Not the shit, well, maybe the shit. Anyways, Bode's initial scripted encounter on Jedi is just what it is, an inevitable defeat regardless of player input.
Rick, I suppose, could theoretically kill you in the same way not wearing a seatbelt while going on a short drive around the neighborhood could kill you. Yes, it is possible that an 18-wheeler going 150 miles per hour could come barreling through a random house, T-boning your sedan and sending your lifeless carcass out the windshield. But, that shit is not happening. I used one hand to shoot Rick in the head and the other to scratch an annoying itch on my nutsack. No effort required for anybody who can perceive objects and movements, which is anyone more than 5 months old with both eyeballs intact.
Always I get the pleasure of writing about the ATST, the noodle-legged walker now more famous for rabbit-shitting concussion mines and getting outsmarted by primordial beavers is best handled swiping away at its thin frame with a lightsaber instead of with blaster deflections from a distance, which is always my first instinct.
Neither Jack nor I have any idea how this fight works. He blocks all the time, but sometimes he stops and you can damage him. Can you break his guard? Can you bait him into making himself vulnerable? I don't know. Unfortunately, never really had to figure it out. While Skriton may be a devastating terror in the world of holo tactics, in an actual fight it's a bit more of a punching bag. While you do need to press square more times than was required to kill anything below here, we're still in a camp where a lobotomite could probably beat it if you electrocuted him in the proper parts of his remaining brain.
You can't die in Star Wars unless you come back and then die again, and then maybe die again for shits and giggles, although Cal made assurances this time by beheading the ninth sister, Sekido style. If she has the attack titan, there might still be a chance, but for the moment she has run her course. This is pretty much identical to her fight from Fallen Order, with the addition of a couple new force abilities and minor differences in attack animations, notably focus sight and force pull. The dual wield stance introduced in the last phase slices her into dinosaur sashimi. Where does she vanish to after also? I wanted to taxidermy her head.
I'd like to clarify that we're counting all the vaguely humanoid bounty hunters under one slot here. The jetpack guys, the shield guys, the grenade guys, the gun guys, all of them. We could have split hairs here since they are different on a superficial level, but the only practical difference is how often I stop spamming them to deflect gunshots. It's like drawing distinctions between weird bugs I see in my house. It doesn't matter how many legs or eyes it's got if I whap them all with the same newspaper. These guys are slippery and pretty good at creating distance from you, whether it be horizontal or vertical. More than that though, they have a secret meta power, much like Psycho Mantis from Metal Gear Solid, making my console shit itself and start sparking with with strain. That run through the Lucre Hulk on the way to Joe the Cannibal was packed with enough bounty hunters to turn my fancy modern video game into that ancient short of a running racehorse. It does beg the question, why do bounty hunters ever target Jedi? I mean, has a non-Force or lightsaber user ever won a fight against a Jedi outside of some esoteric, deep lore, apocryphal legends canon footnote? It doesn't matter how many Urkels you send after John Jones, you've got a bloodbath on your hands.
Helpful informant Cage meets her maker after she decides to give us bounties one puck at a time like a mediocre episodic western, and then take on the same guy she saw casually dismantle 100 plus people exactly like her, like a fucking idiot. She does have the one-shot attack as per all mini-bosses, but dodging it requires conscious reaction, so don't fear. Crossguard decimates anyone associated with Bounty Hunter Weenie Hut Jr. as I called it in the last video, and like a Weenie Hut customer, I got clickbaited en masse with Boba Fett content. Having him as a second phase would have been hard as hell, but just a short cutscene turned into a video farm works too.
Dogun Gera is an emo cornball with comically awkward voice acting, but we still like him. He's like if Fry from Futurama was evil, a description that sounds like one of those videos Dragon Ball YouTubers make about Goku getting locked in the time chamber and having to watch his family get blown up by the Grand Priest. The first fight you have with Dogun Gera begins when you let him out of the Bacta tank, which gave me instant PTSD flashbacks to the Boba Fett show and the horrors within. Thankfully, instead of changing his character completely and joining the neighborhood watch, Dogun Gera remains very consistent with his pre-Bacta self, immediately bleeding his crystal in a fit of rage and trying to kill you. He fights more or less like any other melee fighter in the game, with a few unblockables sprinkled in to make him stand out from the chaff. From a gameplay perspective, it's not very distinct. It's kinda like fighting an elite scout trooper with 20 times the health. You definitely can't be an autopilot, but you should be able to keep up without too much hassle.
The Bedlam Raiders as a whole are like the Imperials pumped on testosterone. The lieutenants aren't even the hardest tier of enemy in their massive little army, but can be a bit of a nuisance on occasion. The single blade lieutenants can break lock by going invisible, and there are also variants with crossguard and double blade, but they are extremely basic and about as mundane as lightsaber duels can get, like Dagan Gera's first fight plus an arm.
Haxian Brood bounty droids love unblockable attacks, which was very bad news for me, who loves spamming and hates dodging. The difficulty of these fights is largely self-determined and based on patience. It may be one of the Jedi virtues, but I do not possess it in any measure. If a cutscene is boring, I skip it. If a fight is boring, I hate on it. If a soulless NPC is slow walking in front of me on the sidewalk, I aggressively speed walk around it. The bounty droid is the antithesis of this mindset, demanding well-timed dodges and measured attacks, only dealt when the droid is in recovery frames. If you fuck up, he's gonna dunk your face into the dirt and chuck you like a ragdoll. These fights could be way lower on the list for some people, but I found them really obnoxious.
The Rancor is in, like, the second available cave to search on Kobo and chomped me into Redhead Jedi Chime for about an hour before I finally came to my senses and mindlessly double jumped repeatedly until I happened to beat it. There's another Rancor on Kobo that's accessible in the late game that I beat with much less trouble, but the pea-sized health bar you start out with, along with BD1 somehow losing all of the stims from Fallen Order to now, makes the first one a nightmare to deal with.
Mechanically, this is very, very similar to the first fight. The reason he's multiple spots higher is that these tweaks to the formula, though few in number, are definitely enough to elevate him from early game speed bump to formidable adversary. He never killed me, but there were a lot more times where I found myself having to back off to heal than in the former encounter. For a guy minus an arm, he sure doesn't seem to be much indisposed by it. That said, he's perhaps a mite too full of himself. All his voice lines are just edgy musings like, "I can smell your delicious terror. You will perish by my blade." Like, you're not that tough, cool it dude, save it for the third match. This second fight is basically the definition of intermediate difficulty, which is fitting given its position capping off the mid-game.
Spike Shigel's last stand only solidifies that he's a delusion dickwad, and that's about it. Alex and I were in deep discussion a few nights ago on FaceTime, and at one point during our long call talking about nonsense and occasionally YouTube work, he proposed the idea that Bode should have been a psychopath using a non-existent daughter as justification for his actions, and when Cal discovers that he doesn't actually have a daughter and is just a mental, he drops the act and flees to Tanalorr. This would have not just been a more interesting narrative route in our opinion, but also would have cleaned up the exposition's dependence on suspension of disbelief, seeing as this fight only happens because every single character relevant to the endgame gets suddenly blinded by stupidity following Seer's death. But Bode does indeed have a daughter and teaches her that disobeying your parents is not socially conforming by using a fully loaded force push on her. Bode is pretty difficult to read, probably because he holds his lightsaber like a dollar store Starkiller and does not have knees. He approaches you at waist height and tilted to the ground and is pretty much unrelenting in his aggressive press to cut off your shins. I use dual wield stance almost exclusively throughout my entire run, and it works really well because of its speed. Its usefulness is especially clear with the likes of Bode and Cage and other faster foes who can get out entire voice lines between Cal's swings with the crossguard and blaster saber, whereas the only noises they make when getting double whacked are grunts and moans. After Bode uses the force, he's very prone to posture damage, so I'd recommend sticking close and pressing when he repeatedly does any move with the force. Otherwise, Space Cowboy relies on his blaster and long-winded combinations for difficulty, landing him as one of the game's tougher fights overall.
Here we have the first fight on the list that killed me, and multiple times at that. Guerra sees a substantial boost in power here, which may or may not be due to him finally spawning an arm to even the odds. The first phase is easy enough because you can have Bode buzz around him like a gnat while you pester him with attacks of your own, but once he slips Cal, a Force Roofie, and sends him to Zodiland, he really becomes a force to be reckoned with. For starters, that air slash attack is pretty tight when it comes to timing to dodge it, and if he catches you in one of those while you're in the middle of an animation or something, God help you, that shit will shred your health like nothing else. A lot of the learning curve here is because you've been conditioned to fight Dagan with almost nothing but parries, and now he can actually punish you for complacency. As for his clones, Force Slow makes them sitting ducks, but if it isn't ready when they pull up, you could find yourself fighting for your life in no time. It's a good thing Cal thought to make him hallucinate his dead girlfriend, calling him a pathetic failure, because things could have gotten seriously messy. Way to think on your feet, champ.
Darth Vader returns for vengeance in a shocking reinterpretation of his base emotional motivations, and lucky for us, we have a lightsaber, meaning we will cut off a piece of his mask, which is seemingly made of tinfoil. This whole thing happens sort of abruptly and takes place through the lens of cleanly shaven Seer instead of Cal. Vader is about half combat and half cinematic, and the combat is fairly formulaic, even apathetic. It's almost cyclical in the way you approach it. Depending on your positioning, you can actually lock Vader into a 4-hit combo rhythm for the first 2 phases entirely. Vader's seemingly a fan of self-imposed struggle and gets consumed with rage every time he suffers from something which was nobody's fault other than his own, and this happens yet again in the Jedi bookstore. Seer crushes Vader with all the might of a baker's dozen of ancient burning novels, leaving the Dark Lord of the Sith with a melted cape, almost like a crop top. Fashion is a touchy subject clearly, and Vader's anger peaks, with much more aggression in this last phase. He still loses, but you still lose. Seer figures to hurtle towards the stationary weapon who, in his current state, is only dangerous when you're close to him, instead of standing back and watching from a distance. Use her as an example that keeping up with the canon is actually important, even life-saving.
Up until this point in the game, the bosses had been pretty easy to get through on intuition alone. Even Dagon Gera 2, the boss immediately preceding this one, more or less plays like the first fight but with scaled up damage. Suddenly Ravis, out of nowhere, decides to drop a Mondo nuke of challenge relative to anyone before him that will bring the weak-willed to their knees. He reminds me a bit of Escharum from Halo Infinite, which for the record is a good thing. He may not be the big bad, so to speak, but he's the real driving force of coolness, and his fight doesn't disappoint. If you spam parries, too bad, bitch, well, fucking shrapnel and blunt force trauma coming right up. You need to be paying close attention to just what he's doing, and given his second health bar, it's not a brief sprint as much as it is a marathon. It demands consistency and thought behind your attacks without subjugating you to frustrating tedium like the bums at the bottom of the list. And so it is that Ravis proves a formidable foe with only one last entity eclipsing even his power in totality.
This feels like Respawn's vindictiveness for selling only 10 million Fallen Order copies, coming not even within smelling distance of EA's required 1-to-1 unit per human quota. Ogdo Bogdo's bastard child, who, considering his noble title is Spawn, did you know Spawn is marked as an offensive synonym for offspring, was made with the purpose of exclusively procreation, and was not just the hardest boss in Jedi Survivor, but maybe of any boss ever. It takes 2 to tango and 3 for double penetration, and if you can't get enough of the buoyant Chernobyl frog creature, a la whoever decided to mate with the Bogdo family heir and pass on a puke green recessive allele to its offspring, there's a forced tear twin Ogdo Bogdo tag team, which took me only 24 hours to beat. The main problem Alex and I have with Spawn of Ogdo is its inability to be blockable, with all of its attacks bar 1 forcing dependence on the fluky evasion mechanic. Otherwise, the special tongue attack is uniquely dodgeable by jumping, but also isn't. Sometimes it works and other times Father Ogdo will perch on top of his dead wedlock litter and lash out his tongue, connect, then politely digest me before immediately regurgitating me back out on contact. Maybe he didn't appreciate the taste of my Everyman Jack forest scented deodorant. Anyways, the lesson? 1. Don't be an insufferable prick and ask for a buffed Ogdo Bogdo. I'm not exactly justified in calling things funny or not, but I feel like these sort of chronically online jokes that end up blowing well beyond proportion are pretty bottom rung on the comedy ladder. As well, forceful vasectomies can be reasonable disregarding ethics, and a scorching lightsaber should have worked fairly well on Ogdo Bogdo however many years prior that took place. Since Star Wars canon doesn't deal with the specifics of reproduction, however, hopefully the Spawn doesn't end up posthumously shitting out another Spawn for us to clash with in this game's inevitable threequel.
Thanks so much for watching, and we hope you enjoyed. We're putting out both a difficulty and a quality ranking this time around and have no idea which is going live first. Whichever ends up being the case, we hope you check out the other one and dig that too. Stay tuned as always for more weekly uploads, and do check out our Discord server and Patreon if you haven't already. That's all for now. Deuces.